What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back. Today we're taking a look at the top 10 rogue decks of the upcoming format, and what a format are we just going to experience. This is just going to be such a good format. We haven't had such a diverse format in a very long time, and to be honest I think Konami has done a really good job with their product releases and with Banlist to make sure that things are diverse and nothing is too broken. And to be honest I think there are so many different decks you can argue for a list like this. There are so many decks that can win if built correctly and if piloted correctly, so I want you guys to comment down below any other decks that I won't mention in this list that you think are going to be really good. If you think that any of the decks I mentioned deserve to be higher or lower in the list, let's have a discussion and see what other decks can be really good contenders for the upcoming format. And now, before we begin the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the list. Number 10, Pendulum. So I'm requiring Pendulum players to sit down, have a thought, and actually this time I want you guys to make this work because Konami has given you a huge boost. I think you can play even more versions now because arguably Endymion was the only playable Pendulum deck before, but now with 2 copies of Double Iris and 1 copy of Joker, Pendulum Magicians are looking much better. And to be honest, one Joker is not that it's inconsistent. You have 3 copies of Pendulum Sorcerer and you have 3 copies of Duelist Alliance to search the Pendulum Sorcerer, so you can search this 1 copy of Joker whenever you want. Yes, maybe getting more copies eventually of Joker is going to be much more helpful, but still with 1 copy you can search it, so it's not like you're requiring to just hard draw an unsearchable card. It's very searchable. So I think Pendulum players can now give the creative lab and see what they can come up with, and I have high hopes for Pendulum players because they are most probably the most dedicated fan base of any deck that I've ever seen. And I know that Konami doesn't really like the Pendulum mechanic, but in this ban list actually they try to be helpful. Instead of giving back Electromite, they give us back other stuff, but still it's better than getting nothing. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to see, at least in the beginning of the format, some Pendulum experimentation. Maybe it won't be as powerful in the upcoming events and they won't have much success, but we'll have to wait and see because you never know, Pendulum players always find a way to surprise us. Number 9, Heroes. The reason Heroes are making a comeback, I think, is mainly because the Heroes are a very format-reliant deck, and the reason being is because they lose to anything that decided to hurt combo. So if people are prepared for combo, something like Dragon Link, and they play stuff like Nibiru or Dark Ruler No More, then Heroes are just not a good deck. But now, this deck, there is not a super dedicated combo deck that is just super good like Dragon Link used to be. So I don't think people are going to main deck stuff like Nibiru, maybe side them, yes, but Heroes, when stuff like that are not in the main deck, then they have a really strong game 1. They can go first, they can go second, the deck has the tools to pretty much deal with anything. So this is why I think that in a format that doesn't rely too much on breaking boards from combo decks and that decks are prepared to play against demi combo decks or control decks too, then Heroes can have a really good chance because they're not going to auto lose to stuff like that. Number 8, Code Talker. So I put Code Talker a lot down compared to what I had at last list. That's because this deck, to be honest, has a really high ceiling, probably the highest ceiling of any deck in the format, but it just loses to so many hand traps. But if it goes uninterrupted, then the board it makes is absolutely unbreakable because, come on, you just cannot do anything with Ibli on the field with Salamangreat Sanctuary. You're not able to crash it because of Avramax, and you cannot really do much. You cannot use something like Lightning Storm, you cannot use something like Evenly because you have something on the field. So if your opponent doesn't open any hand trap, or you have a way to deal with the hand traps your opponent has, maybe something like Call by the Grave, then this deck can thrive really well. When we get Crossout Designator, this deck I think is going to be much better because it doesn't need too many cards in order to combo off, so it can fit in 1 of hand traps with 3 copies of Crossout Designator to make sure that it can combat the hand traps that people play. So when that comes out, I think this deck is going to be much more relevant, but for now I think it's perfectly fine being in number 8 slot. Number 7, Altergeist. Altergeist I think is taking a backseat to Subterror once again, just because, I mean, come on, Dragoon is just an unfair card, and not only that, but now we have the Amazement cards as well, and this is another engine that helps trap decks, but not Altergeist, because Altergeist has the restriction with Multifaker, so you cannot use Multifaker and Arlecchino in the same turn, so I don't think anyone is going to try the Amazements in Altergeist either, and this is why Altergeist is just a deck that just relies solely on its own power, and this is why I think it cannot truly thrive in a format like this, because it's just a deck that needs a little bit in order to go off, but when it goes off, the deck feels absolutely unstoppable. The problem is getting there, but still there will be games that you're going to get to this point and you're going to absolutely overwhelm your opponent because the advantage on this deck can amass is absolutely ridiculous. It feels very unfair once this deck gets rolling, so that's why I think if people are still going to try it, and it's going to be a decent deck for the upcoming format. Number 6, Madolche. Madolche is a really good deck ever since they got their support, and it's a deck that mixes so well with certain cards that other decks can't really main deck, but this deck can just because of the way it plays, by not requiring anything in the graveyard and only having one attribute. attribute, and the cards I'm referring to are Dimension Shifter and Goes Unmatch. These two cards in the main deck can be really devastating, especially Goes Unmatch, because if you're playing against something that is more of a control version, usually control decks do not rely on just one attribute. It's the combo decks that play only dark monsters or something like that, like Dragon Link. Of course, Dragon Link did have other attributes too, but could just play other Goes Unmatch because of all those dark monsters. But when you're playing against other decks that just have so many different attributes, then Goes Unmatch can be a killer. And Dimension Shifter is arguably the best generic hand drop, because pretty much there's not going to be a format from here on out that there are not decks that rely on their graveyard. This is absolutely impossible because of the way the game has evolved. So Dimension Shifter in decks that can play it, and in decks that can actually win on their own, like Madolche, because it's really good going first and going second deck, I think that's going to have a really good chance. So I'm going to keep mentioning Madolche. I think I've had it in the top 10 rogue decks, like in so many formats now, because it's just that good. The deck can OTK, the deck can build a decent board, and with these cards being able to be main decked, it makes it just so much better. So keep an eye out for this deck, you're going to see it. Number 5, Plunder Patrol. Patrol got the card that it had been looking for pretty much like such a long time. The deck always felt incomplete, but with Raven Wing, it just has this extra extender and recovery that it never had, because the deck starts slow. It's very similar to Altergeist in a sense. It starts very, very slow, and then it starts building up all the advantage you need in order to overwhelm your opponent with all the ships, and Raven Wing just makes it much more consistent, and the deck can play cards like Desires to get even more draw power. Pretty much I think that it's the only deck right now, along with Salamangreat, that Desires is such a good card in the deck because you don't really care. Other decks have switched to Prosperity, but still Desires is a +1, so in decks like these that really need this plus in order to get rolling during the early game, then cards like these are really good, and the deck has ways to deal with anything. It has backward removal, it has monster removal, it has monster negates. The deck is really, really good. It can even power up its monsters to a degree that it can even deal with stuff like Dragoon that usually it cannot deal with because it doesn't have anything that doesn't target and doesn't destroy Dragoon, so it needs to beat it over with sheer attack power. But still, Plunder is a deck that people love, and I think that is a deck that are going to see play a lot, and just be prepared for this deck because it's going to be a really good rogue deck. People are going to try it in events too because the deck has the potential in order to win. I think the top 5 decks that I'm putting in this list are the decks that have the potential to steal slots from top cuts in events, so I think these are the decks that you should be most prepared for, and Plunder Patrol is the first of them. Number 4, Orcust. Orcust with Scrap Raptor, I think the deck just got what it needed to get the consistency it needed in order to be able to play. Girsu would have been a good option if Harp Horror had come back along with Engage and Stalio, but this did not happen, so I still think the Scrap engine is by far superior to Girsu, so I don't think there's even a point in playing Girsu now, because the Scrap cards, if you just make them resolve, then you get so much advantage. And what the deck ceiling did not go higher, it's just that it got the consistency it needed, because yes, when you did open Scrap Recycler before, you did the same combo, but now you have 12 copies of Scrap Recycler instead of 3 because of Fossil Dig, Scrapyard, and Scrap Raptor, so the deck is so consistent, can do what it can pretty much every single game as long as it goes uninterrupted, and this deck doesn't lose to anything particular. It's one of those decks that has the advantage of anything, because when you play something like a combo deck, you lose to Droplets or Dark Lure. When you play a backrow deck like Altergeist and Subterrors, you lose stuff like Harpy's Feather Duster and Lightning Storm. This deck doesn't lose to either of those because it can have negates on the field with stuff like Lib and Masquerena going into Appaloosa and also bouncing a card. It can have a counter trap with your Crescendo. It can have grave effects with Babel and being able to use Skeleton to go to Girsu during your opponent's turn. So it does have something to deal with pretty much anything, and relying on one particular type of combo is something that makes you lose to stuff like, which is like Heroes is a lot lower on the list because it dies to anything that kills combo because it's a hard dedicated combo deck. But stuff like Orcust means that you can do so much more and you can be a very resilient deck, so I think this deck is going to be a really good contender for the upcoming format. Now, the top 3 decks I'm going to mention, these 3 decks are so good that it could easily become a part of the top 10 meta decks of the format, but there are just so many decks that can win that it's really hard to keep up of what tops of what can win, and I think that these 3 decks could have easily been in the previous video we did with the top 10 meta decks. So if you did not see these decks in the previous video and you thought that they were not good enough, no, they are really, really good, but I just could not fit all these decks in just the top 10, so I'm just putting these as the top of this list just because I just had to find space. So the first one, number 3, is Virtual World. Virtual World is a deck that can still pretty much do exactly what it did before, it just has to go through an extra step, because you can still do Calamities in a certain way. You can summon Crystal Wing with the Caliga on the field and the Continuous Trap, and what this basically is basically Calamities. You just negate the only monster effect that your opponent is allowed to do, and you destroy the one monster that your opponent is allowed to attack with because of Caliga with the Continuous Trap, and what do you have? You have Calamities. Your opponent cannot activate monster effects and your opponent cannot attack. So this deck is just that it lost the easiest access to an effect like this, but can still do pretty much the same, and the deck is so so consistent with all those cards being extenders in the hand, so it's going to be a really good deck, and people have forgotten pretty much about it, so they are not prepared for something like this. So I think Virtual World is going to steal a lot of slots in the top cuts. It's just going to be such a good deck, and I think the deck is pretty budget now. I don't think you need anything. I mean, Lulu is a decently expensive card, but not nearly as expensive as to compare to stuff like Drytron, so still, this is going to be a really good budget deck, and people are going to try it out because it's so good. Number 2, Picky Fire. Picky Fire, I think, is going to make the biggest comeback ever that it has ever done, just because of King's Court, because of Utopic Future Dragon. This card just adds so much in the deck, because when you had like stuff like Dante's, and yes, you can go into Beatrice, but now you have an even better monster to go into with all those copies that you keep bring back from the grave, because you can bring back a Seer, you can use a Seer to bring back a Dante, you can use a Fogblade to bring back a Breaksword, and then you just have a Utopic Future Dragon on the field, and with that, you can just win the game, because this card is so oppressive. It just negates effects, steals monsters, and it's very hard to deal with. This card is going to give new life to this deck, and it's going to see a lot more play. The deck is really good because it has the same things as Orcus does, because it doesn't lose to either battery removal or monster removal, because it can summon a Palooza, it can summon Beatrice, and also have the Fogblade set, so it's a mix of both worlds. This is why this deck is so resilient. The recovery of this deck is absolutely insane. You cannot grind with this deck unless you're playing something like Eldritch, because you get all these effects back from the graveyard, otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed during the late game. So this is why I think Picky Fire is going to be a huge deck because of King's Court, and we're going to see it a lot more. And the number 1 deck. Out of all these decks, I think that the number 1 deck just is like 2 levels above all the other decks I mentioned, and that's Adignister. Adignister probably is going to become not part of the top 10, but part of the top 5 most meta decks eventually, because people are just starting to realize what this deck is capable of. The 1-card combos it can do, it's just insane. Being able to use 1 card to end on something like the Arrival, a Cyber's Quantum, and a Dunmari in the graveyard, and still have the spell you searched back in your hand, plus 4 other cards you can use to deal with your opponent's plays, is absolutely insane. You can do so many combos with so little resources, which is what defines a really good deck. I think, why do you think Zodiac was such a good deck when it used to be? It's because it could do just so many combos by using only 1 Rat Peer, and this is basically the same. If you summon an Achichi, you can do all these combos, have all these cards in your hand. The deck can fit so many hand traps in the deck, because you don't really need so many resources in order to do all those combos. Yes, you search through a lot of cards, but being able to search the field spell, being able to search all the monsters, all the spells and traps, means that your engine is so good that you can fit in traps, you can fit in hand traps, depending on the format you're playing in, so you can counter pretty much anything. This is why it has really good potential for big events too, because you can adapt in the format and make sure that you play the cards necessary in order to beat pretty much anything. The Arrival is a monster that people are not prepared for, because they always think that these Ultimate Falcon type monsters are very easy to beat because of cards like Boral Sword and Access Code Talker, but Dunmari and Cyber's Quantum make sure that your opponent will have a hard time dealing with the Arrival, and the OTK on the field is just there because Cyber's Quantum can use Grand Mold Effect and attack twice, and the Arrival is 4k beater, so you don't really need much more damage in order to OTK during the next turn. So this deck is just such a good deck. I feel like it's a much better version of Code Talkers. It feels very similar. The ceiling might not be that high, but the consistency and the resiliency is so much more powerful, and this is why I think that Adignister, as long as people keep innovating with the deck, people keep trying out the deck, because the deck is fairly new. It's not fairly new, but the support it got made it being a top contender, so I guess it's fairly new, and people just started playing it, and they're going to play it a lot more, and the more people keep playing this deck, the more it's going to see representation in the top cuts, and the more people are going to win with it. So I think that this deck is eventually 100% going to become a part of the top 10, if not top 5 best meta decks of the format. So yep, that's the video, guys. I think this format is going to be so good. There's so many other decks. Like I said, I want you to mention in the comments any other decks that you have experimented with, any other decks that you think that are going to be really good, because you could argue like 20 more decks for this list. This is going to be an insane format we're going to have, and I think we should enjoy formats like this for as long as possible, because you never know when Konami is going to release a new broken deck that is going to overshadow all of these decks, and you either have to play this one deck or completely counter the deck, or it's impossible to play. But for now, this format, I don't think there's anything broken. I think every deck is perfectly balanced. Anything can lose, anything can win, and we're going to have such a great time playing Yu-Gi-Oh! So yep, that's the video, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.